The morning sun had barely risen when Margaret Flynn stepped off the bus, her worn leather handbag clutched tightly against her side. The city was just waking up, but Margaret had been awake for hours already. At 52, she had learned that early mornings were a gift, quiet moments before the chaos of the day took over. She approached the gleaming glass tower of Denton Enterprises, a building she knew intimately, though not in the way most people did. Margaret didn't attend meetings in the conference rooms or make deals in the corner offices. Instead, she knew which desk drawers stuck, which executives left coffee rings, and which offices had the best view of the sunset. For 7 years, she had cleaned these offices, moving through the building like a shadow after everyone else had gone home. Today was Tuesday, which meant the executive floor. Margaret nodded to the security guard, Tom, who smiled warmly as he buzzed her through. Unlike some of the executives, Tom always greeted her by name. "Early as always, Maggie," he said, handing her the sign-in clipboard. "Can't clean properly when people are around," she replied with a small smile, signing her name in neat, careful letters. Her handwriting was something she took pride in. Her 6th-grade teacher had once called it the penmanship of someone with important things to say. As the elevator climbed to the 40th floor, Margaret mentally prepared for the day ahead. Her daughter Lily had an important exam at college next week, and the tuition payment for next semester was coming due. The second job at the diner helped, but lately, the hours on her feet were taking a toll. Her back ached more than she cared to admit. The elevator doors opened to reveal the hushed plush carpeting of the executive floor. Margaret pushed her cleaning cart toward the supply closet, the familiar routine settling over her like a comfortable blanket. She changed into her work uniform, navy blue with the cleaning company's logo, and began her rounds. The floor was empty this early, just how she liked it. She moved from office to office with practiced efficiency, emptying trash bins, wiping down surfaces, and vacuuming carpets. When she reached the corner office belonging to Robert Denton, the company's founder and CEO, she paused as she always did. Robert Denton was something of a mystery. Unlike the other executives who paraded through the building in expensive suits, loudly discussing deals on their phones, Denton was rarely seen. Rumors about him circulated constantly, that he was secretly ill, that he was a genius who worked through the night, that he was eccentric and difficult. Margaret had only seen him twice in 7 years. Both times he had been leaving late, looking tired but stopping to thank her for her work. She unlocked his office with her master key and stepped inside. The space was immaculate, as always. Denton was not one for clutter. His desk held only a computer, a notepad, and a single framed photograph of what looked like a mountain range. Margaret began her usual routine, careful not to disturb anything. As she dusted his desk, she noticed something unusual: a cream-colored envelope placed squarely in the center. In bold black letters, someone had written, "If you read this." Margaret stepped back, vacuum cleaner forgotten in her hand. In 7 years, she had never seen anything like this. Was it meant for Mr. Denton? For his assistant? She frowned, uncertain. It wasn't her place to touch personal items, let alone read them. She had always prided herself on her professionalism. But something about those bold letters nagged at her. They seemed almost like a challenge sitting there in plain sight. And why leave something so attention-grabbing on an otherwise empty desk? "Not my business," she muttered to herself, turning away to vacuum the carpet. But her eyes kept drifting back to the envelope. What if it was important? What if it was urgent? Margaret finished cleaning the office, pointedly ignoring the envelope. She was nearly at the door when she stopped and turned back. Something didn't feel right. In all her years cleaning offices, she had developed a sixth sense about things that were out of place. With a sigh, she walked back to the desk and picked up the envelope. It was sealed, but her name wasn't on it. No one's name was on it, just that strange, commanding phrase. She turned it over in her hands, feeling the weight of the heavy paper. "This is silly," she told herself. "Put it down and leave." But she didn't. Instead, her thumb slid under the seal, breaking it with a soft tear. Margaret held her breath, suddenly feeling like she had crossed a line she couldn't uncross. Inside was a single sheet of paper, folded neatly. She pulled it out and unfolded it, her heart beating a little faster than normal. "To whoever has the courage to open this," the letter began in the same bold handwriting as the envelope. "I've been watching." Margaret's hands trembled slightly. She glanced around the empty office, half expecting to see cameras or someone stepping out from behind the curtains, but there was only silence. She continued reading. For months I've been conducting a silent experiment. I've watched how people behave when they think no one is looking. The executives who take credit for others' ideas. The assistants who gossip about their bosses. The board members who care more about their bonuses than the company's future. Margaret sank slowly into the visitor's chair across from the desk, the letter still in her hand. "And I've watched you," the letter continued. "The woman who straightens the pictures on the wall, even though no one would notice if they were crooked. Who waters the plants, even though it's not in her job description. Who treats every space with respect, whether it belongs to the CEO or the newest intern." A chill ran down Margaret's spine. Someone had been watching her. All this time? "My name is Robert Denton, and I'm looking for someone to take over my company." Margaret nearly dropped the letter. This had to be a joke. A prank by one of the other cleaning staff, or maybe one of the junior executives who sometimes worked late. It couldn't possibly be real. But the signature at the bottom matched the one she had seen on company memos posted in the break room, and there was a personal phone number written below it, along with instructions to call if you're interested in changing your life. Margaret folded the letter carefully and slid it back into the envelope. Her mind was racing. Why would a billionaire business owner leave such a note? And why would he even consider giving his company to a cleaning woman? She placed the envelope back exactly where she had found it and continued with her work, trying to focus on the familiar motions of cleaning. But her thoughts kept returning to the letter and its impossible suggestion. By the time she finished the executive floor, it was nearly 9 o'clock, and people were starting to arrive for the day. Margaret wheeled her cart to the service elevator, nodding politely to the early arrivals who barely glanced her way. On her bus ride home, the letter was all she could think about. Was it real? Was it some kind of test? And if it was real, what would it mean for her and for Lily? Margaret lived in a small apartment 20 minutes from downtown. It wasn't much, but she had made it home. Photos of Lily lined the walls. Lily as a gap-toothed 7-year-old. Lily in her high school graduation gown. Lily in her college sweatshirt. Every sacrifice Margaret had made was for those smiles. She made herself a cup of tea and sat at her kitchen table, the memory of the letter still vivid in her mind. The phone in her pocket seemed to weigh 100 pounds. "This is crazy," she whispered to herself. "People like Robert Denton don't give their companies to people like me." And yet, she pulled out her phone and stared at it. What did she have to lose by making one phone call? At worst, it was a cruel joke, and she'd be embarrassed. At best, Margaret couldn't even imagine what at best might look like. Her finger hovered over the keypad. The number from the letter was seared into her memory. With a deep breath, she began to dial, not knowing that this simple action would be the first step on a journey that would change everything. Margaret's heart pounded as she waited through 3 rings before someone answered. Denton speaking. The voice was deep and clear, without a hint of sleepiness despite the early hour. For a moment, Margaret couldn't speak. What was she supposed to say? "Hello, I'm your cleaning lady and I read your private note." "Hello?" the voice prompted. "Mr. Denton," she finally managed. "This is Margaret Flynn. I clean your office." There was a pause and Margaret's stomach twisted. She was about to apologize and hang up when he spoke again. "Margaret, you found my note." It wasn't a question. "I've been waiting for someone to call this number for 2 weeks. Margaret gripped the phone tighter. "I shouldn't have opened it. It wasn't addressed to me specifically, but I still shouldn't have." "But you did," he interrupted, his tone warming slightly. "And that's the first test passed." "Test?" Margaret echoed, confusion replacing her guilt. "Curiosity," Denton explained. "You can't run a company without it. You need to ask questions, look deeper than the surface." Margaret sank into her kitchen chair. "Mr. Denton, I think there's been a mistake. I'm not a business person. I clean offices. I know exactly who you are, Mrs. Flynn. You've worked for the cleaning service that maintains my building for 7 years. You're a widow with a daughter in college. You work a second job at Hal's Diner on weekends, and you're the only person in that entire building who waters the dying plant in the break room." Margaret's mouth went dry. How did he know all that? As if reading her thoughts, Denton continued. "I make it my business to know the people who work in my building. All of them. Not just the ones with fancy titles." Margaret's gaze drifted to the bills stacked neatly on her counter. The electric bill was marked with a red final notice. "What exactly are you proposing, Mr. Denton?" she asked, surprising herself with her directness. "A series of challenges," he replied. 5 in total. Each one designed to test different aspects of business acumen, creative thinking, and character. Complete them all successfully and I'll make you my successor. Margaret almost laughed. "Your successor? For a billion-dollar company?" "Mr. Denton, I didn't even finish community college." "Education and experience come in many forms," he said simply. "Are you interested or not?" Margaret thought about Lily, about the tuition payments, about her aching back and tired feet. What did she have to lose? "I'm interested," she said. Finally. "Good. Come to my office tomorrow morning at 5:30. I'll explain everything." The line went dead before Margaret could respond. Margaret arrived at Denton Tower at 5:15 the next morning, too nervous to sleep much anyway. To her surprise, Tom, the security guard, had specific instructions to let her up to the executive floor. "Big meeting with the boss?" he asked as he handed her a special access card. "Something like that," Margaret replied, unable to explain what she herself didn't understand. The elevator ride felt longer than usual. When the doors opened, she half expected to find the floor dark and empty as it always was at this hour. Instead, lights blazed from Robert Denton's corner office. She knocked hesitantly on the open door. "Come in, Mrs. Flynn." Robert Denton looked different than she remembered. Younger somehow, more energetic. He wore a simple button-down shirt with no tie, and his salt-and-pepper hair was slightly tousled. He didn't look like a typical billionaire CEO, but more like a college professor working late. "Please, sit," he said, gesturing to a chair across from his desk. Margaret sat, feeling oddly underdressed in her plain blouse and slacks, the nicest clothes she owned that weren't her work uniforms. "I suppose you think I'm crazy," Denton said, a slight smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "The thought had crossed my mind," Margaret admitted. Denton laughed, a genuine sound that made him seem even more human. "Fair enough. I'd think the same in your position." He reached into a drawer and pulled out a thick manila envelope, sliding it across the desk toward her. "First, let me explain why I'm doing this. I built this company from nothing over 30 years ago. It's been my life's work, but I have no children, no family to leave it to, and the people who work for me now," he shook his head. "They're good at their jobs, but they lack something essential." "And what's that?" Margaret asked. "Perspective," Denton said simply. "They've never known struggle, never had to make something from nothing, never had to see problems from different angles because the usual approaches weren't available to them." Margaret nodded slowly, understanding. "That's why I created this challenge. I've been watching everyone in this building for months looking for someone with the right combination of intelligence, integrity, and grit. And you think that's me? A cleaning woman?" Denton leaned forward. "I think it could be. That's what these challenges will determine." He tapped the envelope. "Inside are the details of your first challenge. You'll have 1 week to complete it." Margaret reached for the envelope, surprised by its weight. "What exactly am I supposed to do?" "The first challenge involves finding waste," Denton explained. "Every successful business leader needs to know where money is being lost. Inside that envelope is our company's quarterly expense report. Your job is to identify at least 3 areas where we're spending money unnecessarily." Margaret stared at him. "But I don't know anything about corporate expenses. Don't you?" Denton raised an eyebrow. "You see things others don't, Margaret. You clean the conference room after the board meetings. You empty the trash cans filled with receipts and reports. You notice which departments leave their lights on all night and which executives order the most expensive lunches on the company card." Margaret thought about all the documents she had glimpsed over the years, the conversations she had overheard while dusting around executives who acted as if she were invisible. "I'll try," she said finally. "That's all I ask." Denton stood, signaling the end of their meeting. "One more thing. This needs to remain between us. If anyone asks why you're meeting with me, tell them you're discussing a special cleaning project." Margaret nodded, clutching the envelope. "Oh, and Margaret?" Denton called as she reached the door. "I've arranged for you to have access to an empty office on the 38th floor. You'll need somewhere private to work on these challenges." The office was small but had a window with a view of the city. Margaret had never had an office before. She had always been the person who cleaned them, not the person who worked in them. She sat at the desk, her desk at least temporarily, and opened the envelope. Inside was a thick stack of papers filled with numbers, charts, and corporate jargon she barely understood. Her heart sank. How was she supposed to make sense of all this? But as she flipped through the pages, certain things began to stand out. The catering budget for executive meetings seemed astronomical. And why did the company need 5 different software subscriptions that appeared to do the same thing? Margaret remembered overhearing the IT manager complaining about duplicate systems just last month, and she recalled the mountains of untouched food she threw away after board meetings. Slowly, methodically, she began making notes, drawing on years of observations that had seemed unimportant at the time. By lunchtime, she had already identified 2 areas of significant waste. Over the next few days, Margaret developed a routine. She would arrive early, clean her assigned floors quickly, then spend a few hours in her temporary office before heading to her second job. She slept less than usual, but she hadn't felt this energized in years. On the 3rd day, she discovered something surprising in the expense reports. The company was paying rent on a storage facility that housed old paper records. But everything's digital now, she murmured to herself, remembering the massive scanning project from 2 years earlier, when temporary workers had spent months digitizing all the company's old files. Margaret added this to her growing list, feeling a small surge of pride. This was actually making sense to her. On the 7th day, just as she was putting the finishing touches on her report, there was a knock at her office door. She looked up to see Robert Denton standing there. "Time's up, Margaret," he said, his expression unreadable. "What have you found?" Margaret handed him her neatly typed report, 5 pages in total. She had spent $20 at the copy shop to make it look professional. Denton skimmed the first page, then the second, his eyebrows rising higher with each turn of the page. When he finished, he looked at her with new respect in his eyes. 8 areas of waste, he said, sounding impressed. "I only asked for 3, Margaret shrugged. "Once I started looking, they were hard to miss. And your suggestion to consolidate the software systems would save us nearly $1 million annually." He tapped the report. "Did you know that?" "I figured it was a lot," Margaret said. "The IT manager was always complaining about paying for tools no one uses." Denton smiled. "Congratulations, Margaret. You've passed the first challenge." Relief flooded through her, followed quickly by disbelief. Had she really done it? Ready for the second challenge? Denton asked, pulling another envelope from his jacket pocket. Margaret thought about the piles of laundry waiting at home, the extra shift she had promised to cover at the diner, the tuition bill that was now officially late. Then she thought about what it would mean to never worry about those things again. "I'm ready," she said, reaching for the envelope. The second challenge was harder than the first. Much harder. "Create a marketing strategy for our newest product line," Denton had explained, handing her a folder containing information about a smart home security system that Denton Enterprises was planning to launch the following quarter. Margaret stared at the glossy product, sheets and technical specifications with growing unease. She knew nothing about marketing. The closest she'd ever come was putting up handwritten flyers offering house cleaning services when Lily was small and they needed extra money. For 2 days, she avoided the challenge entirely, focusing on her regular cleaning duties and her shifts at the diner. But the folder sat in her bag like a weight, a constant reminder of what was at stake. On the 3rd day, as she wiped down tables at the diner, she overheard a conversation between 2 customers. "These home security systems all look the same to me," an older woman was saying to her friend. "I can't figure out which one to get for my daughter. She lives alone and I worry." "My son got one of those fancy ones," her friend replied. "Cost him a fortune and he still can't figure out how to use it properly. The alarm goes off every time his cat walks by the sensor." Margaret found herself listening intently as the women discussed their frustrations with existing security systems. Too complicated, too expensive, false alarms, difficult installation. That night, instead of going straight home after her shift, Margaret sat in a booth at the back of the diner with a cup of coffee and a notepad. She began writing down everything she'd heard, not just today but over the years, about home security. Her own neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, had gotten a security system after a break-in on their street. She was always complaining about forgetting the code and setting off the alarm. And then there was the delivery man who couldn't leave packages because people were afraid to give him the code to disarm the system. Suddenly, Margaret had an idea. What if the security system could recognize trusted people, Not just with codes or key cards that could be lost or stolen, but somehow recognize them as individuals? She began sketching a concept, her handwriting cramped but clear. By closing time, she had filled several pages with ideas. The next morning, she arrived at her temporary office earlier than usual and started researching. The computer intimidated her at first. She had only basic experience with computers from the library, but she quickly discovered that typing questions into the search bar brought her a world of information. She learned about facial recognition technology, about voice authentication, about pattern recognition. Some of it went over her head, but she understood enough to refine her idea. When Denton came to review her work 4 days later, Margaret handed him not just a marketing strategy, but a completely new approach to the product itself. The problem with most home security systems, she explained, surprising herself with her confidence, is that they're designed by people who understand technology, not by people who use it every day. She showed him her concept, a system that combined traditional security features with a simple interface that could learn to recognize family members, regular visitors, and trusted service providers. The marketing strategy writes itself, she concluded, peace of mind without the headaches. Denton studied her proposal, his expression thoughtful. This would require significant changes to the product design. Margaret's heart sank. She had misunderstood the challenge. He wanted a marketing strategy for the existing product, not a new concept. I'm sorry, she began. I got carried away. No, Denton interrupted, a slow smile spreading across his face. This is exactly what I was looking for. Someone who doesn't just follow directions but sees a better path. You've passed the second challenge, Margaret, with flying colors. Word began to spread through the building about the cleaning woman who was spending time in a private office on the 38th floor. Margaret noticed the curious glances, the whispers that stopped when she entered a room. What's going on with you lately? Asked Betsy, another cleaning woman who had worked at Denton Enterprises for almost as long as Margaret. People are saying you're meeting with Mr. Denton himself. Margaret remembered her promise to keep the challenges secret. Just a special project, she said vaguely. Nothing exciting, but it was exciting. The third challenge had been about resource allocation, deciding which of 3 proposed projects the company should invest in. Margaret had approached it like managing her household budget, which expenses were necessary, which were wants, and which were just plain wasteful. The fourth challenge had been the hardest yet, analyzing a struggling division of the company and recommending whether to invest more money in it or shut it down. That one had kept her up at night not because the business analysis was difficult, though it was, but because she kept thinking about the people who would lose their jobs if the division closed. In the end, she had proposed a third option, restructuring the division to focus on its most profitable products while retraining employees for other positions within the company. When she presented her solution to Denton, he had been quiet for a long time. You know, he said finally, not one of my executives suggested saving the jobs. Their analyses were all about maximizing profit, regardless of the human cost. Margaret thought about all the conversations she'd had with janitors and security guards and cafeteria workers over the years, how they worried about layoffs every time profits dipped. People work harder when they feel secure, she said simply, and training new people is expensive. Denton had nodded slowly. You understand something many business leaders never grasp, Margaret? A company is more than its balance sheet. It's a community. Now, as Margaret arrived for her meeting with Denton to receive her 5th and final challenge, she felt a strange mix of emotions, pride in how far she'd come, fear of the final test, and an odd sense of loss, knowing that soon this extraordinary interlude in her ordinary life would end, one way or another. Denton was waiting in her small office, not his own, which surprised her. He looked tired, the lines around his eyes deeper than usual. Are you all right, Mr. Denton? Margaret asked before she could stop herself. He looked up, seeming startled by the question. Just a long night. Board meeting ran late. He gestured to the chair across from him. Please sit. We need to talk. Margaret sat, her hands folded in her lap to hide their trembling. 4 challenges completed, each one more impressively than the last. Denton said, You've exceeded my expectations in every way, Margaret. Thank you, she said quietly. But there's a problem. Denton leaned forward, his expression serious. People are talking. The board is asking questions about my meetings with you. They're concerned about what they call unusual activities. Margaret's stomach tightened. I've been careful not to say anything. I know. This isn't your fault, Denton sighed. The truth is, I underestimated the resistance I would face. The idea of a cleaning woman, forgive me, but these are their words, not mine. Becoming CEO is not sitting well with them. I understand, Margaret said. And she did. She had seen how the executives looked through her, not at her, for years. It was a nice dream while it lasted. I didn't say I was giving up, Denton said, a hint of steel entering his voice. Just that we need to accelerate our timeline. The 5th challenge was supposed to be gradual, but now, he handed her a thick binder. This is everything you need to know about the company's operations, finances, and strategic plans. Study it. In 3 days, you'll present to the board as my chosen successor. Margaret stared at the binder, then at Denton. The board? But you just said they're already against this idea. They are, Denton agreed, which is why your presentation needs to be flawless. You need to show them what I already know, that you have what it takes to lead this company into the future. And if I can't convince them? Denton's expression was unreadable. Then I'll have a very difficult decision to make. For the next 3 days, Margaret barely slept. She studied the binder until the words blurred before her eyes, making notes, asking questions, researching terms she didn't understand. She called Lily to tell her she wouldn't be able to make their weekly phone call. "Mom, what's going on?" Lily asked, concern in her voice. "You sound exhausted." "Just a big project at work," Margaret said, not ready to explain something she herself could hardly believe. "I'll make it up to you next week, I promise." On the morning of the presentation, Margaret arrived at Denton Tower wearing the only business outfit she owned, a navy blue skirt suit she had purchased years ago for job interviews, freshly dry cleaned and pressed. She rode the elevator to the executive floor, her heart pounding so hard she was sure everyone could hear it. The boardroom doors loomed ahead, massive and intimidating. Robert Denton was waiting for her in the hallway. "Ready?" he asked quietly. Margaret clutched her notes, her knuckles white. Was she ready to face a room full of executives who had never once noticed her existence? Ready to convince them she could run a billion-dollar company? "No," she admitted, "but I'm going to do it anyway." Denton smiled, and for a moment, Margaret saw something like pride in his eyes. "That," he said, opening the boardroom door, "is exactly the attitude a CEO needs." The boardroom fell silent as Margaret entered behind Robert Denton. 12 pairs of eyes turned to stare at her, expressions ranging from confusion to barely concealed disdain. She recognized most of them. She had cleaned their offices for years, after all, but they were seeing her for what felt like the first time. "Ladies and gentlemen," Denton said, taking his place at the head of the long mahogany table, "thank you for agreeing to this special meeting." A man in an expensive gray suit leaned forward. Margaret knew him as Victor Phillips, the chief financial officer. She had overheard him once complaining about having to pay overtime to the cleaning staff during the holidays. "Robert," Phillips said, his voice smooth as silk but with an edge like a knife, "you still haven't explained why this person is joining our board meeting." His eyes slid over Margaret as if she were a piece of furniture slightly out of place. Margaret's face burned, but she kept her expression neutral. She had expected this. "This person," Denton replied, his tone sharp, "is Margaret Flynn, and she's here because I've spent the last month testing her abilities in areas ranging from financial analysis to product development to corporate strategy." A woman in a red blazer, Diane Winters, the head of marketing, let out a small incredulous laugh. "The cleaning lady? Is this some kind of joke?" "No joke," Denton said firmly. "Margaret has completed a series of challenges that I designed to test her aptitude for business leadership. And she has outperformed my expectations at every turn." The board members exchanged glances. A heavyset man at the far end of the table, Gregory Walsh, the company's general counsel, cleared his throat. "Robert, while we all respect your unorthodox management style, this is highly irregular. Ms. Flynn has no business experience, no education in management, no preconceived notions about how things should be done," Denton interrupted. "No loyalties to the old ways of thinking. No blinders preventing her from seeing innovative solutions." He turned to Margaret. "Ms. Flynn has prepared a presentation. I ask only that you listen with an open mind." Margaret stepped forward, setting her folder on the table. Her hands were trembling slightly, but she took a deep breath and reminded herself of what was at stake. Not just for her and Lily, but for everyone at Denton Enterprises who, like her, had been invisible for too long. "Good morning," she began, her voice steadier than she had expected. "My name is Margaret Flynn. For the past 7 years, I've cleaned your offices, emptied your trash cans, and dusted your awards. You've walked past me 1,000 times without seeing me." She paused, making eye contact with each board member in turn. "But I've seen you. I've seen how this company works from the ground up. I've heard your conversations, read the memos you've discarded, observed the patterns that you're too close to notice." Philip snorted softly, but Margaret continued. "Mr. Denton has given me access to the company's financial records, strategic plans, and operational reports. I've studied them carefully, and I've identified several areas where Denton Enterprises is falling short of its potential." She opened her folder and removed a stack of handouts, passing them around the table. "The first issue is internal communication. Your departments operate in silos, with the right hand often not knowing what the left is doing. For example, last quarter, the marketing team launched a promotion for a product line that the production team was planning to phase out. The result was back orders that couldn't be filled and frustrated customers." Diane Winters frowned, flipping through the report. "The second issue is employee retention at the middle management level. Denton Enterprises spends an average of $45,000 to recruit and train each new manager. Yet your turnover rate is 23% higher than the industry average. Exit interviews suggest the primary reason is a lack of upward mobility and recognition." Gregory Walsh raised his eyebrows, clearly surprised by her command of the facts. "The third issue, and perhaps the most concerning, is innovation. While your competitors have launched an average of 3 new product lines in the past 2 years, Denton Enterprises has launched only 1, and that one was merely an update to an existing product. Not a true innovation." For the next 20 minutes, Margaret laid out her analysis of the company's strengths and weaknesses, backed by data she had painstakingly compiled. She concluded with a series of recommendations, from restructuring the product development process to implementing a cross-departmental communication system. When she finished, there was a long silence. Margaret stood still, waiting for the ridicule she was sure would come. Instead, Phillips leaned forward, his expression thoughtful. "Your analysis of our cash flow issues in the European division is surprisingly accurate. How did you come by this information?" "From the quarterly reports," Margaret replied, "and from overhearing Mr. Torres on the phone with the Frankfurt office. He mentioned that they were having trouble with currency exchange losses, but when I checked the financial statements, those losses weren't being properly accounted for." Phillips looked at Denton, then back at Margaret. "And your solution, hedging against currency fluctuations through forward contracts, where did that come from?" "My daughter is studying international finance," Margaret explained. "When I asked her about the problem, that's what she suggested. I researched it further and ran the numbers." Diane Winters tapped her pen against her notepad. "And what about your suggestion to target the senior market with our home security system? Our market research indicates that millennials are our primary demographic." "With respect, Ms. Winters, your market research is asking the wrong questions," Margaret said. "Younger people are more comfortable with technology, yes, but they're also more price-sensitive and less concerned about security. Older adults have the disposable income and the genuine need for these systems, but they're put off by complicated interfaces and technical jargon." Winters looked skeptical. "And you know this how?" "I listen to people," Margaret said simply. "At my second job at the diner, older customers talk about wanting security but being intimidated by technology. Younger customers like the idea of smart homes but balk at the price tag." One by one, the board members began asking questions. To Margaret's surprise, they weren't trying to trip her up or dismiss her ideas. They were genuinely engaging with her analysis, challenging her assumptions, testing her understanding. And with each question, her confidence grew. She knew this company, not from spreadsheets and boardroom presentations, but from the ground level. She had watched it operate day after day, year after year, with the perspective of someone who was simultaneously inside and outside the system. After nearly an hour, Denton raised his hand, bringing the discussion to a close. "Thank you, Margaret," he said. "Would you mind waiting outside while the board discusses your presentation?" Margaret nodded, gathering her materials. As she walked toward the door, she felt their eyes on her back, but the quality of their gaze had changed. There was confusion still, yes, and probably some resentment, but there was also something new. Respect. In the hallway, Margaret sank into a chair, suddenly exhausted. The adrenaline that had carried her through the presentation was wearing off, leaving her drained. What had she been thinking? These people ran $1 billion corporation. She cleaned toilets and served coffee. How could she possibly believe she belonged in that room? Yet a small voice inside her, a voice that sounded surprisingly like her late husband's, whispered that she had earned her place at that table. Not despite her background, but because of it. Because she saw what others missed, valued what others overlooked, understood what others ignored. The boardroom door opened, and Robert Denton emerged. His expression gave nothing away. "They'd like to speak with you again," he said. Margaret stood, smoothing her skirt with trembling hands. "How bad is it?" A smile tugged at the corner of Denton's mouth. "Go and see for yourself." She walked back into the boardroom, chin up, ready to face whatever verdict they had reached. The board members were murmuring among themselves, but fell silent as she entered. Victor Phillips, who had been so dismissive earlier, was the first to speak. "Ms. Flynn," he said, his tone formal but respectful, "we've discussed your presentation and your unique qualifications. While there are understandable concerns about your lack of traditional business experience, we cannot deny the value of your insights." Margaret held her breath. "The board has agreed to a proposal from Mr. Denton," Phillips continued. "He has suggested a 6-month transition period, during which you would work alongside him as co-CEO, learning the aspects of the business with which you are less familiar, while contributing your perspective on areas needing improvement." Margaret looked at Denton, who gave her a small nod of encouragement. "At the end of this period," Phillips concluded, "assuming satisfactory performance, Mr. Denton would step down, and you would assume the role of Chief Executive Officer of Denton Enterprises." The room seemed to spin around her. This couldn't be happening. Things like this didn't happen to people like her. I don't know what to say," Margaret stammered. "Say yes," Denton said quietly. Margaret looked around the table at the faces of the board members, some encouraging, some still skeptical, all waiting for her response. She thought about the stack of bills on her kitchen counter, about Lily's tuition, about all the nights she had lain awake worrying about the future, and she thought about what she could do with this company. The changes she could make, the people she could help. "Yes," she said, her voice growing stronger with each word. "Yes, I accept." 1 year later, Margaret stood at the window of her office, the corner office that had once belonged to Robert Denton. The view of the city still took her breath away sometimes. On clear days like today, she could see all the way to the river, sunlight dancing off the water. "Ms. Flynn, they're ready for you in the conference room." Margaret turned to see her assistant Penny standing in the doorway. Even after a year, it felt strange to have an assistant, to be the person others answered to rather than the other way around. "Thank you." "Penny, I'll be right there." As Penny left, Margaret took one last look at her reflection in the window. The woman who stared back at her was both familiar and strange. Still Margaret Flynn, but with a new confidence in her posture, a new purpose in her eyes. Her clothes were different too, of course. The cleaning uniform and diner apron had been replaced by tailored suits and comfortable but elegant shoes. But the biggest changes weren't visible on the outside. The past year had been the most challenging and rewarding of Margaret's life. The 6-month transition period working alongside Robert had been a crash course in corporate leadership. There had been so much to learn: financial statements, market analysis, personnel management, public speaking. There had been resistance too. Not everyone had been quick to accept the former cleaning woman as their boss. Some executives had resigned rather than work under her. Others had stayed but made their skepticism clear at every opportunity. Through it all, Margaret had remained true to herself. She hadn't tried to become someone else, to adopt the polished mannerisms and corporate jargon of her predecessors. Instead, she had brought her own style to the role, straightforward, practical, and deeply empathetic. And gradually, the results had begun to speak for themselves. Margaret gathered her notes and headed for the conference room, nodding to people as she passed. Unlike the previous CEO, who had rarely ventured beyond the executive floor, Margaret made a point of walking through the entire building regularly. She knew most employees by name, from the newest interns to the maintenance staff who had once been her colleagues. The conference room fell quiet as she entered. Around the large table sat the board members, several top executives, and a group of journalists from the business press. Today was the company's annual meeting, where they would announce their yearly results. Victor Phillips, who had remained as CFO and become one of Margaret's strongest allies, stood to greet her. "Everyone's here, Margaret. Shall we begin?" Margaret nodded and took her place at the head of the table. She looked around the room, meeting the eyes of each person present before speaking. "Thank you all for coming today. As you know, when I became CEO of Denton Enterprises 1 year ago, many people had doubts. Some of you in this room had those doubts." She smiled slightly, and I understood why. I had no business degree, no corporate experience, and no connections in the industry. What I did have was a different perspective and a promise to bring positive change to this company. She nodded to Phillips, who pressed a button on his laptop. The large screen on the wall lit up with a series of charts and graphs. "Today, I'm proud to report that Denton Enterprises has achieved a 37% increase in profits compared to last year." A murmur of appreciation ran through the room. Even the most skeptical board members looked pleased. "But that's not the achievement I'm most proud of," Margaret continued. "What matters more to me are the changes we've made to how this company operates. Changes that I believe are responsible for our financial success." She clicked to the next slide, which showed employee satisfaction ratings. Our employee turnover rate has decreased by 28%. Sick days are down by 15%, and participation in our employee suggestion program has tripled. Margaret looked around the room, noting the journalists scribbling frantically in their notebooks. "When I was a cleaning woman, I saw how much talent and potential was being wasted in this company. People at all levels had good ideas, but they weren't being heard. So the first change I made as CEO was to create pathways for those ideas to reach decision makers." She clicked to another slide, showing a young man in the company cafeteria. "This is David. 6 months ago, he was serving food in our cafeteria. He mentioned to me that he had an idea for improving our inventory management system. In the old Denton Enterprises, his idea would never have gone anywhere. In our company today, David was given time and resources to develop his concept, which we've now implemented across all our warehouses, saving us over $2 million annually." Margaret continued through her presentation, highlighting other success stories. The receptionist whose customer service innovations had improved client retention, the security guard whose safety suggestions had reduced workplace accidents, the janitor who had spotted a pattern of energy waste that, once addressed, had cut the company's utility bills by 1/3. "These results didn't happen because I'm some kind of business genius," Margaret said candidly. "They happened because we started listening to everyone, not just the people with fancy titles. They happened because we recognized that good ideas can come from anywhere, and that everyone deserves respect and opportunity." She moved to the final slide, which showed the details of 2 new company initiatives. Today, I'm pleased to announce 2 new programs that will build on this philosophy. First, the Denton Education Fund, which will provide college scholarships and vocational training for our employees and their children. Margaret thought of Lily, who had just graduated from college debt-free thanks to Margaret's new salary. That was a gift she wanted to give to others. Second, the Employee Ownership Program, which will give every person who works at Denton Enterprises, from executives to maintenance staff, shares in the company based on their years of service. This announcement caused a stir among the board members. They had debated this program extensively, with some arguing that it diluted their own shares too much. But Margaret had been firm, and Robert Denton, who still held a significant stake in the company, had backed her completely. "I believe that when people have a real stake in the company's success, they bring their best selves to work. And that's good for everyone, employees, customers, and yes, shareholders too." As the presentation concluded, and the room broke into small discussion groups, a reporter from the Wall Street Journal approached Margaret. "Ms. Flynn, your story has captivated the business world. From cleaning woman to CEO in less than 2 years. It's unprecedented. What do you say to those who call it a publicity stunt?" Margaret considered the question. She had heard the whispers, read the critical articles suggesting that she was just a figurehead, that Robert Denton was still pulling the strings behind the scenes. "I say look at the results," she replied simply. "Not just the profits, though those speak for themselves. Look at how this company has changed. Look at the opportunities we're creating, the talent we're nurturing, The community we're building. Judge us by our actions, not by where I came from. The reporter nodded, jotting down her response. And what about Robert Denton? How involved is he in day-to-day operations? Margaret glanced across the room to where Robert stood chatting with some board members. He caught her eye and gave her a small nod of approval. Mr. Denton serves on our board and remains a valued advisor, she said, but he's enjoying his retirement now. He trusts me to run the company. As the reporter moved away, Robert approached. Impressive presentation, he said quietly. You've exceeded even my expectations, Margaret. Thank you, she replied. For everything. For seeing something in me that I didn't see in myself. Robert shook his head. I didn't put anything there that wasn't already inside you. I just gave you the chance to show it. Later that evening, as the office emptied and the building grew quiet, Margaret found herself walking the familiar corridors of the executive floor. Out of habit, she straightened a picture that hung slightly askew, adjusted a chair that was out of place. The cleaning crew would be arriving soon. The same company she had once worked for, though with better wages and benefits now. Thanks to the new contracts she had negotiated, she stopped by the break room and watered the plant in the corner, a small gesture she had continued, even after becoming CEO. It reminded her of where she had come from, of the person she had been and still was, underneath the title in the office. As she headed toward the elevator, she passed a woman in a cleaning uniform, pushing a cart laden with supplies. Their eyes met, and Margaret smiled warmly. Good evening, she said. The woman looked startled to be addressed by the CEO, then smiled back hesitantly. Good evening, Ms. Flynn. Margaret, please, she corrected gently. And you are? Rosa, the woman replied, her surprise giving way to a genuine smile. Rosa Hernandez. It's nice to meet you, Rosa, Margaret said, extending her hand. I hope you don't mind me asking. How long have you been working here? 3 months, Rosa answered, shaking Margaret's hand. Margaret nodded thoughtfully. Do you enjoy it? Rosa hesitated, then answered honestly. The work is okay. It pays the bills. My daughter, she's in high school, wants to go to college. That's why I work 2 jobs. Margaret felt a jolt of recognition. This woman's story so similar to her own not so long ago. Your daughter is lucky to have you, she said. And we're lucky to have you here. If you ever have ideas about how things could be improved around here, anything at all, my door is always open. Rosa looked confused. Ideas from me? Especially from you, Margaret said firmly. The people who clean these offices see things the rest of us miss. They notice patterns, problems, opportunities. I should know I was once where you are now. Understanding dawned in Rosa's eyes. The stories about you, they're true then? You really were a cleaning woman? Margaret smiled. I still am in many ways. I just clean up different kinds of messes now. As she rode the elevator down to the lobby, Margaret thought about Rosa and all the others like her. People with talents and ideas that might never be discovered without someone taking a chance on them. Robert had taken that chance with her. Now it was her turn to hold the door open for others. Outside, the evening air was cool and fresh. Margaret decided to walk for a bit before calling her driver,